Hello everyone, today we're going to be taking a look at the Disputed Questions on Truth by St. Thomas Aquinas. Question 2, God's Knowledge. Article 1, Is there knowledge in God? This is from a genre of literature that the scholastics were wont to put out, which essentially looks at a series of questions and gives a answer to them. Sometimes the answer is original, sometimes it's derivative. Attendant with this is a series of objections, the arguments of the author, the position of the author, and the replies to the objections. The structuring is supposed to help the students engage with the content. So Aquinas always puts the objections at the beginning, and then he puts his own arguments and opinion. And then he puts the replies to the objections at the end. The reason for doing this is that it forces you, if you're actually going to track, to pay close attention to the objections so that you can understand them. If you internalize the objections, then the responses will make sense. If you don't, then it'll all be nonsense. We have the table of contents here, which, of course, it goes with the objections and then the arguments of Aquinas, then his opinion, then the replies to the objections. So part 1, objections. From simplicity. Knowledge is an addition to an essence. A simple being cannot have additions to their essence. Therefore, a simple being cannot have knowledge. God is a simple being. Therefore, God cannot have knowledge. A lot of the objections today are going to center around simplicity, which makes sense. Because when I think of my own knowledge, it's not something which is identical to me. I have knowledge of a little MP3 player I have charging. I'm looking at it right now. It's red and black, and it says SanDisk on it. The SanDisk MP3 player is not, like, my idea of it is not something which I have permanently. It's not something which I have of my very nature. It's not something which is the same as me. It's something which is added. But because nothing can be added to God, there can be no knowledge in God, at least of this kind. That's from simplicity. Then from God's transcendence. No noun can be predicated of God that is not predicated of God's entire being, again from simplicity, because everything that is in God is God, as they say. 2, nothing can be predicated of God's entire being. Therefore, no noun can be predicated of God. Every noun will fail in its description. Every ratio will fail in its description of God. Then we have against science. Science is a habit in the soul of proceeding from premises to conclusions. So here he's just saying that we have, when we're proceeding in some sort of metaphysical or theological science, we have a series of premises and we derive conclusions from the premises. And then the second premise here is God does not proceed in thought. Therefore, God does not have science as a mode of understanding. So the reason for premise 2 is that, again, God is simple. There is no succession in God. God is existing all at once. There is no before and after, either logically or temporally. Then we have against science. Again, it's pretty anti-science. In science, there are things that are less known, that are derived from things that are more known. So there are things which are more obvious to us and things that are less obvious to us, and we learn about the less obvious things from the more obvious things. Premise 2, nothing is less or more known of God. Conclusion, so in God there is no science. From impressions, Al-Ghazali says that knowledge is an impression on the soul. God can receive no impressions of any kind, again from simplicity. Therefore, God can have no knowledge. We have from imperfection. Nothing implying an imperfection can be found in God. Knowing or knowledge implies an imperfection, therefore knowledge cannot be found in God. So this takes a little bit of spelling out, especially premise 2. Knowledge implies an imperfection. So the scholastic idea of imperfection is has to do with the lack of having a fully completed essence. There's something better than what you are at the moment. Now, if a being has, completed its life, gone through everything, maybe it's a perfected member of its species, but it had imperfections at one point, which it solved. However, God can have no imperfections of any kind. So when we're saying that knowledge implies imperfection, there's this first moment of God's existence where he lacks the knowledge. And then there's an action or an impression on God, and he receives knowledge. And now God is more perfect than he was before. There's a change in God. Change, again, on the scholastic idea, implies imperfection. If anyone is interested in this, they can read David Oderberg's book, The Metaphysics of Good and Evil, or The Order of Things, Realism About the Principle of Finality by Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. Then there is a reply to Aquinas' answer to the last question. So the objector says, your reply to the last objection said that God's knowledge is eternally actual. It's permanently and eternally actual. However, God's knowledge is the cause of things. So contingent things are eternally actual, which is false. So this is essentially saying that God's knowledge is permanently correct and unchanging, and it causes the world. So the world is permanent and unchanging. However, this is obviously false, so the premise must be denied that God's knowledge is eternally actual, or that it causes the world. Either one of those has to be denied, or you'll be making creation necessary and also eternal. Next, we have an argument from Augustine. Knowledge is a certain kind of form. God is above all forms, therefore God is above all knowledge. Pretty simple, straightforward, very nice. Then we have, on the contrary, what does Aquinas say? First, there is a quotation from the Epistle to the Romans. Oh, the depths of the riches of the wisdom and of the knowledge. It mentions God's knowledge. Then there's also a mention of Anselm's perfect being theism. According to Anselm, we must attribute to God everything which is better absolutely to have than not to have. Knowledge is a perfection of this kind, so it must be attributed to God. Then we have from the structure of knowledge. There are three things required for knowledge: an active power in the knower, a thing known, and a union of both. However, God is the most active power possible, the most knowable thing, and he is identical to both of those, so there is a union of both. Therefore, God has the three things required for knowledge: the thing known, the knower, and their union. And, they're all identical to God. Now we have part 3, the opinion of Aquinas. So first, Aquinas argues against habit. In God, knowledge is not a habit, the same way science is a habit in humans. The successive knowledge of one thing that leads to another in the human mind. If this was the case, then God would be composite, but he's not composite, so this can't be the case. Then he has an argument against a kind of analogy of attribution. So in regular language, we have this kind of analogy called the analogy of attribution. The classic example is the word healthy. Healthy can be said of urine, it can be said of a person, or it could be said of food. However, it's said of all of these in a different way. Healthy is said of urine as a sign of health. It's said of the person as being healthy, and it's said of food as causing health. So Aquinas here is arguing that our reason for saying God has knowledge is not by way of this analogy of attribution. It's not because God causes knowledge that he is knowledgeable. That's not what we mean. So it's not like that. So if knowledge is only said of God as the cause of knowledge, then God does not really have knowledge. God really has knowledge, so it is not said of God merely by attribution. Against metaphor. This is a loose kind of analogy of proper proportionality. An example of this is the field was smiling. The flowers were so beautiful, the field was smiling. So in a case of analogy of proper proportionality, or analogy of proportionality rather, not proper proportionality. In a case of analogy of proportionality, there is this kind of mathematical relationship, like 4 over 2 is equal to 8 over 4. There's this relationship where they equal each other. They both come out to 2 if you do all of the operations. So the question here is, are we saying these things of God in the same way that we would say that? So an example of this, again, is, the field, or the flowers in the field are to, my sight as smiling is to a human face, something like that. So this would be a case of metaphor. However, Aquinas wants to say that our God having knowledge is not simply a case of a metaphor, because then God would not really have knowledge. Then he says how it is said. Knowledge designates the whole divine essence in the same way that life, essence, and goodness designate the divine essence, which is to say they designate it in whole, they don't designate it in part, and they designate it imperfectly. This is the divine essence. All of these attributions are known through similarity with creatures, and the perfections which they signify, like goodness or life, or knowledge, are all existing in God in a way that they are perfectly unified, which is not the way they exist in creatures. In creatures, they exist as distinct and multiple. If anyone is interested in reading about this, there's 2 good books which have come out, which I've been researching recently. One is called Rereading Cayetan, The Semantics of Analogy, by a guy named Hochschild, and the other one is called Analogy After Aquinas by Dominic de Torre. Both of those are very good. I'll be leaving links in the description for anyone interested. Then we have part 4, the replies to the objections. Simplicity and transcendence. Knowledge is only had by addition when the essence and the knowledge are distinct. However, in God they aren't distinct, so this isn't an issue. As for divine transcendence, the truths are truly signifying the divine essence. They just do so improperly. For signs? Question mark. God knows all things simultaneously by knowing himself. He does not need a kind of progression in his knowledge from knowing one thing and then from that leading to another thing. He also does not know by impressions, but by his own self-knowledge. He knows by his own essence. On imperfection. God's knowledge is eternally actual, and as a result, there's no imperfection implied in God's knowledge. The second half of this is to say that contingent things are temporal, but God's knowledge of them is eternally actual. So God knows contingent things, but he knows them as kind of like almost like theoretic knowledge, where God's knowledge is eternally actual and it eternally exists. However, the creatures, the temporal things, exist only in time and non-eternally. Next, on representation, the forms in our minds aren't in God. They only allow an imperfect knowledge. They aren't technically in God. They are similar to God. So our ideas of God are simply similar and not univocal. They're not literally picking out objects in God. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed.